Quartered safe out here is George MacDonald Fraser's memoir of his experiences as a young soldier in the British Army during World War II's Burma campaign. Blending humor and stark realism, Fraser vividly recounts life on the front lines, capturing the camaraderie and harsh realities of war. Let's begin. Because I dislike books that bewilder me by assuming I know technical details that I do not, and also for the record, I will explain how we were dressed and armed. Burma was a bare-bones war. In many ways, we were like soldiers of the last century in that our arms and equipment were very simple. This was because it was largely a close contact, hand-to-hand war in which, while tanks, aircraft, and artillery played an important part, it was first and foremost an infantryman's business. Actions tended to be on a smaller scale compared to the battles in Europe. By today's standards, we were sparsely equipped. Thank God. The uniform was all dark green, even underpants, vests, and socks had gone into the big dye vat at Ranchi. Watch straps had to be green or khaki. You had 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, puttees, a better protection than anklets against leeches and other crawlies, and boots, British made, if you were lucky, rather than the clumsier Indian pattern. Later, we sometimes wore captured Japanese jungle boots, with their thick crepe soles. A few, like Parker, dispensed with socks and filled their boots with tallow, claiming that it prevented blisters. It was also messy and stank. I tried it, once. 14th Army's distinguishing feature was the bush hat, that magnificent Australian headgear with a rakish broad brim which shielded against rain and sun and was ideal for scooping water out of wells. In some ways, it was a freak, in the steel-helmeted 20th century, and it may have cost some lives under shell fire, but we would not have swapped it. It looked good, it felt good. If you could have boiled water in it, you would not have needed a hotel. Everyone carried a razor blade tucked into the band, in case you were captured, in which event you might, presumably, cut your bonds, decapitate your jailer by stages, or if the worst came to the worst and you were interrogated by Marshal Tojo in person, present a smart and soldierly appearance. Equipment consisted of the standard web belt, cross braces, pouches worn brassiere fashion, small pack containing 2 mess tins, piala, enameled mug, knife, fork, and spoon, housewife with needle and thread, water purification pills, pacrine, to ward off malaria, which it did not, and any personal effects you felt like carrying, plus your rations, a pint water bottle, entrenching tool, a steel mattock head with a detachable handle, and a log line, a 5-yard coil of thin rope. The last 3 items hung from the belt behind. A small trouser pocket contained a field dressing, but everyone scrounged a spare one because the gauze made a splendid sweat rag cum neckerchief. Weaponry was equally simple. There were a few Tommy guns, but none of the hated Stens, the plumber's nightmare, in the company, but the standard arm was the most beautiful firearm ever invented, the famous short Lee Enfield, either of the old pattern with the flat backside and long sword bayonet, or the Mark IV with the pig sticker, a 9-inch spike with no cutting edge. The old pattern, which I carried, was the great rifle of the First World War, which the old contemptibles used with such speed and skill that the enemy often believed they were facing automatic weapons. One German general told of how his division had been shot flat by its disciplined fire. It held 10 rounds with its magazine charged and another up the spout, had an extreme range of close to a mile, and in capable hands was deadly accurate up to 400 yards. I am no Davy Crockett, but I could hit 3 falling plates, about 10 inches square, out of 5 at 200, and I was graded only a first-class shot, not a marksman. The Lee Enfield, cased in wood from butt to muzzle, could stand up to any rough treatment, and it never jammed. She's your wife, as the musketry instructors used to say. Treat her right, and she'll give you full satisfaction. And she did, 30 years old as she was. Treating her right consisted of keeping her clean, bright, and slightly oiled with the pull-through an oil bottle in her butt trap, and boiling her out after heavy firing. She is a museum piece now, but I see her still on television newsreels, in the hands of hairy, outlandish men like the Mujahideen of Afghanistan and capable-looking gentry in North Africa, and I have a feeling that she will be loosing off her 10 rounds rapid when the Kalashnikovs and Armalites are forgotten. That is the old reactionary talking. No doubt Agincourt diehards said the same of the longbow. Nowadays the automatic rifle, and concentrated firepower, are the thing, spraying rounds all over the place, which must give rise to hideous supply problems, I imagine. We had it drummed into us that each round cost 3 pence, 1 bullet, 1 Japanese was proverbial, if obviously impractical. I know I sound like a dinosaur, but I doubt if the standard of marksmanship is what it was. It cannot be, except at short range, and I wonder what happens if, say, a bridge has to be blown from a distance because there is no fuse, and someone has to hit a gun cotton primer the size of a 10-pence piece at 200 yards? A sapper lieutenant did that in Burma, with a Lee Enfield, 1 shot. Possibly such problems do not arise in modern high-tech war, or perhaps they just plaster the bloody thing with automatic fire, and hope. But I digress. We carried 50 rounds apiece in a canvas bandolier draped over the buttocks. Apart from the bayonet, the other essential sidearm was the kukri, the curved short sword of the Gurkha, slung behind the right hip. Mine cost me 10 rupees, and some swine pinched it near Rangoon. The alternative was the da, a long, broad-bladed machete. In one pouch, you carried 2 armed 36 grenades, Mills bombs, and these posed a problem. A grenade has a split pin holding in place an arm which, when the pin is withdrawn, releases a plunger which causes havoc with a fulminate of mercury detonator. Depending on the internal fuse, you then have 5 or 7 seconds to get rid of the thing, or good night, sweet prince. The cast iron casing is split into segments like a chocolate bar, and on explosion, these segments, plus the base plug, will take care of anything within 5 yards, give or take. The question is, do you, when given grenades to carry, render them safe by hammering the split ends of the pin apart, or, bearing in mind that an angry Japanese soldier is not going to stand around while you unhammer them, do you leave the pins so that they can slip out easily? The thought that Grandmas, who would make a bullock look security conscious, is snoring beside you with his pins loose is no inducement to untroubled sleep. In practice, you just left them extractable with a sharp tug, and if Victor McLaglen, who is to be seen in old movies yanking the pins out with his teeth, ever tried it during his own army service, his incisors must still be in Mesopotamia. You do it with your finger or thumb. There was another type of grenade, the plastic 77, which was a smoke bomb. It also sprayed phosphorus about and was used in clearing bunkers. In the other pouch were 2 Bren gun magazines, holding between 25 and 30 rounds, for the section's light machine gun, rifle and Bren ammunition being identical. The Bren gunner normally fired from a lying position with his number 2 alongside to change magazines if required and turn the immediate action plug when the gun jammed, as it could when overheated. It was a good gun, but needed intelligent handling, for when held firm, it was accurate enough to punch a hole in a brick wall with a single magazine, and to get a good spread, the gunner had to fan it about judiciously. It could also be fired from the hip, given a firm stance, for without one, it would put you on your back. Any other weapons were a matter of personal choice. Most of the section carried long-bladed flick knives, bought in Indian bazaars. My own knife was something like a commando dirk, worn with the butt protruding from the small pack, behind the right shoulder. The only other personal items were the rubberized ground sheet, folded inside the top of the small pack. Later we were issued waterproof monsoon capes, a blanket, and a canvas water shaggle, carried only if you were marching some distance, and only those who have been really dry know that there is no drink like shaggle water, brackish, chlorinated, with a fine earthy silt at the bottom, pure Gunga Din juice. We hated it and would have sold our souls for it. I should also mention the pale green masks, with eye slits a la Dick Turpin, worn only if you were traveling by truck through dusty country. They were not for concealment. Camouflage paint was unknown, nor did we ever black up, presumably because sun and dirt made it unnecessary. We were not bearded, that was a Chindit fashion. I grew a beard at the end of the campaign when I was away from the battalion, but that was sheer laziness, and swank, and I got rid of it after a few weeks. So there we were, 9 or 10 men with 1,000 rounds of 303 and 20 grenades among us, and if my list has been a long one, it still describes one of the most lightly armed and least encumbered foot soldiers since the introduction of firearms in war. It was gear designed for fast, easy movement by the lightest of light infantry, and I wonder why it has gone out of fashion. The question is prompted by what I see on television of the army today. To my eye, the loose camouflage blouse is ugly, clumsy, and ill-fitting compared to our tight shirt and trousers. It might have been designed to catch on snags and hinder its wearer. As if that wasn't enough, the poor infantryman is festooned with more kit than would start a quartermaster store. I am sure it's all necessary, I just cannot think what for. I do not like the helmet and suspect it cramps head movement. Very well, I am old-fashioned and ignorant, but I hold that a streamlined soldier is better off than one who looks as though he has been loosely tied in the middle, and I would hate to try to crawl through a hedge or swim a river in that lot. Perhaps if those who design the Army's equipment had to do either of those things, they would come up with something better. I suppose our war was different. A military historian has written that 14th Army was stripped to the belt, and certainly it took makeshift and improvisation for granted and relied, when it had to, on what it could carry and what was dropped to it from the air. While you were with your trucks, you were part of a mechanized force, transport, tanks, artillery, and all. There was a company cookhouse, dispensing bully stew and boiled eggs, mostly, a regular water truck, and a medical officer and padre, the regimental police and familiar army organization, and perhaps even a Church of Scotland or Salvation Army mobile canteen. I can see it now, a jungle clearing and two smiling douce old ladies from Fife, with their battered tea urn and tray of currant scones. My goodness, Annie, we are running out of sandwiches. Did I not say we needed another tin of spam? Dear me. More tea, boys? And afterward, they would rattle off in their truck, first gear, Annie, and do not rev the motor, woman. Oh, I take a hammer to it. Bye-bye, boys, beaming and waving and adjusting their hairpins, with Japanese just up the road. There are heroines, I have seen them. That was with the battalion, but there was no doubt that those long desperate months in the cuds and jungle, before my time, had bred in 9 section an aptitude for something closer to guerrilla warfare. When the trucks had been left behind, and the battalion had faded into the distance, things were different. The long patrol, the independent operation at platoon or section level, the scout to an outlying village or just to a map reference, the lying up perhaps in a ruined temple at what seemed the back of beyond, the feeling of being part of a river foray, the section seemed somehow easier, if not happier, at that kind of work. You felt that if the army had vanished, and they had been left alone in that wild country halfway to China, they would have damned the government, had a smoke, and carried on regardless, picking up this and that on their way back to India. I must emphasize that the platoon, much less the section, did not operate independently very often, and only in the later stage of the campaign when the nature of the war had changed from a pursuit in divisional strength to a more confused and piecemeal operation whose object was the final demolition of the beaten Japanese armies. By then they were scattered and disorganized, often into quite small parties, so it was no longer a question of a general advance by 14th Army with set-piece battles, but of roadblocks and ambushes and patrolling on a smaller scale. Those were the conditions in which the section might find itself briefly on its own, and the occasions, mercifully few, which are large in my memory are those on which, having attained the dizzy height of Lance Corporal, I had nervous charge of 7 or 8 old sweats watching with interest to see what the young idiot would do next. To me each decision was momentous, whether it was to sleep down in a village for the night, turn for home, ford a milk-white river with snake-like shapes writhing in its depths, or allow the section to accept rice cakes from an evil-looking headman who was so greasily friendly I was convinced he was a Japanese collaborator. He wasn't, as it turned out, nor did his rice cakes contain ground glass. Small stuff, I know, but it seemed very big stuff then. I might have found decisions easier if the others hadn't kept reminding me, with gloating obscenity, that I wasn't old enough to vote at the forthcoming general election. It was a reminder that I had not been trained for authority in eccentric warfare. The young soldiers' battalion had given excellent military instruction, but no guidance on what to do if, on a long patrol, we found a group of obvious Indians in their underwear holed up in a shone, they were deserters to the Japanese Indian National Army, or if the section lunatic decided to shoot a vulture in open paddy, thereby alerting any Japanese who might be within earshot, or how to cope with a seasoned veteran who, in a lonely basher at night, swore that there were Japanese outside, hundreds of them but only 18 inches tall, and led by his Member of Parliament, Sir Walter Womersley, Minister of Pensions. He was the only case, the veteran, not Womersley, that I ever encountered of what is now called, I believe, post-battle trauma. I am sure it would need psychiatric reports and counseling by social workers nowadays, but the section simply advised him to take his cookery to them, which he did, cleaving the air and crying, "Pensions, you old bastard," before going back to sleep. He was entirely normal for the rest of the campaign. What I had been trained for was to be an obedient cog in the great highly disciplined machine that was launched into Europe on D-Day. That would at least have been in civilized countryside, among familiar faces and recognizable environment, close to home and the main war effort, in a campaign whose essentials had been foreseen by my instructors. The perils and discomforts would have been no less, probably, but they would not have been unexpected. It is disconcerting to find yourself soldiering in an exotic oriental country that is medieval in outlook, against a barbarian enemy given to burying prisoners up to the neck or hanging them by the heels for bayonet practice, among a friendly population who would rather turn bandit than not, where you could get your dinner off a tree, be eaten alive by mosquitoes and leeches, by handmade cheroots from the most beautiful girls in the world, with granny watching, puffing her biddy and rolling the tobacco leaf on her scrawny thigh, wake in the morning to find your carelessly neglected mess tin occupied by a spider the size of a soup plate, watch your skin go white and puffy in ceaseless rain the like of which no Westerner can imagine for sheer noise and volume, gape in wonder at huge gilded pagodas silent in the wilderness, and find yourself taken aback at the sight of a domestic water tap, because you haven't seen such a thing for months. It seemed a terribly old-fashioned kind of war, far closer to the campaign my great-uncle fought when he went with Roberts to Kandahar, he's buried somewhere in Afghanistan, I wore his ring in Burma, than to what was happening in Europe. Compared to that, or the electronic campaigns of today, it looks downright primitive. Not that the electronic campaigns won't be primitive enough, when the barrage lifts and the infantry start walking. If it seemed somehow to be a long way back in time, it was also a very long way from home, and had taken a lot of hot, we were traveling to get to. It was a far corner of the world, and even though a letter written in Carlisle on Sunday could be in your hands in a showing by the Sitang on Thursday, when you opened the blue airmail form and saw the well-remembered writing, you had the feeling that it came from another planet. That's not a complaint, or an attempt to suggest special hardship. Our campaign, or at least what I saw of it, Impel and the Northern Cuds being something else, was probably no harder than any other. But you did feel the isolation, the sense of back of beyond. Perhaps that came, in part, from being called the Forgotten Army, a colourful newspaper phrase which we bandied about with derision. We were not forgotten by those who mattered, our families and our country. But we knew only too well that we were a distant sideshow, that our war was small in the public mind beside the great events of France and Germany. Oh God, I'll never forget the morning when we were sent out to lay ambushes, which entailed first an attack on a village believed to be Japanese held. We were lined up for a company advance, and were waiting in the sunlight, dumping our small packs and fixing bayonets, and Hutton and Long John were moving among us, reminding us quietly to see that our magazines were charged and that everyone was right and ready. Nixon was no doubt observing that we would all get killed, and someone, I know, was muttering the old nonsense. Sister Anna will carry the banner, Sister Kate will carry the plate, Sister Maria right marker, Salvation Army, by the left, charge. When a solitary Spitfire came roaring out of nowhere and victory rolled above us. We did not get it. On the rare occasions when we had air support, the victory roll came after the fight, not before. While we were wondering, an officer, he must have been a new arrival, and a right clown, ran out in front of the company and shouted, with enthusiasm, "Men! The war in Europe is over." There was a long silence while we digested this and looked through the heat haze to the village where Japanese might be waiting. I'm not sure that the officer wasn't waving his hat and shouting hip, hooray. The silence continued, and then someone laughed, and it ran down the extended line in a great torrent of mirth, punctuated by cries of "Get the boogers out here." "And have you told Tojo, like? And hey, son, is it all right if we all go home?" Well, he must have been new, and yet to get his priorities right, but it was an interesting pointer. But if we resented, and took perverse pleasure in moaning, as only Cumbrians can, about our relative unimportance, there was a hidden satisfaction in it, too. Set a man apart and he will start to feel special. We did. We knew we were different and that there were no soldiers quite like us anywhere. Partly it sprang from the nature of our war. How can I put it? We were freer, and our own masters in a way that is commonly denied to infantry. We were a long way from the world of battle dress serge and tin hats and the huge mechanized war juggernauts and the waves of bombers and artillery. When Slim stood under the trees at Makeitilo and told us, "Rangoon is where the big boats sail from," the idea that we might one day get on one of those boats and sail halfway around the world to home might seem unreal, but it was a reminder that we were unique, and I don't give a damn who knows it. We were 14th Army, the final echo of Kipling's world, the very last British soldiers in the old imperial tradition. I don't say we were happy to be in Burma, because we weren't, but we knew that Slim was right when he said, "Someday, you'll be proud to say, I was there." Mind you, as Grandmas remarked, we would have to get out of the bloody place first. Aye, Jock lad, what fettle? Not bad, Sergeant, thank you. Champion. They tell us you're a good cross-country runner? Oh well, I've done a bit. Get away. I've seen you winning at Ranchi, traveling like a bloody trail hound when the whistles go on. Here, have a cigarette. Thank you very much, Sergeant. Senior service. Sergeant's mess issue, lad. Take another for after. Aye, you can run, won a few prizes in Britain, did you? Well, now and then, 7 and 6 in savings certificates, that sort of thing. I'll bet you're the fastest man in the battalion, over a mile or two. Aye, in the brigade, likely, maybe the division. Oh, I don't know about that. There must be some good runners. Give over, Jock. A fit young fellow like you? Honestly, now, wouldn't you back yourself against anybody in 17th Indian? Well, you would. Outrun the bloody lot of them, eh? Well, I'd be ready to have a go. Good for you, son. And you're a first-class shot, aren't you? Good, you're just the man to be sniper scout for the section. Eh? Sniper scout? What's that? Well, you know what a scout does. When the section comes to a village, the scout goes in first, to see if Japanese are there. 2. Draw their fire. Use your loaf, man, Japanese are not that bloody stupid. Usually, they let the scout go through or wait until he's right inside the position and then lays him out, quiet-like. So the scout has to keep his wits about him, you see, and as soon as he spots Japanese, he fires a warning shot, and runs off. So he'd better be a good runner, Wouldn't he? Does it matter? I mean, if he's surrounded by bleeding Japanese, he might as well be on crutches. Don't talk daft. If he's quick on his feet, he can get out, easy. Didn't you play rugby at that posh school of yours? Yes, but the opposition wasn't armed. Oh well. Here, you said sniper scout. Where does the sniping come in? Well, that's when we're pulling out of a position, not going in. Sniper scout stays behind, hidden in a tree or bushes or something, and waits until the Japanese come up. And then snipes one of them? Aye, but not just anybody. He waits for a good target, an officer, or maybe one of the top brass, if he's lucky. Bloody lucky, yes. And then he nails him. And runs, I beg your pardon, buggers off. That's right, son. He gets out and goes like the clappers. Being a good long-distance runner. I see. Flawless logic. Well, it must be a great life, as long as it lasts. Well, it's a job for a slippery young fellow, not old fat boogers like Grandmas, or half-fit sods like Nick and Forster. I'm glad you volunteered, Jock. Here, have another cigarette. Thanks, Sergeant, but I wouldn't want to spoil my wind. By the way, does a sniper scout get extra pay? You know, danger money? Extra pay. Danger money. You've been picking up 7 and 6 at every cross-country in Britain, and you're wanting more? You greedy little git. It's right enough what they say about you Scots, you're always on the scrounge. The Battle of Maictilaw was hard and bloody, with the enemy garrison nearly annihilated. Even at Maictilaw, the few prisoners taken were wounded. Unlike the European campaign, where thousands of Germans surrendered, there were no mass surrenders here. Slim, regarded by some as the finest general the Second World War produced, led us with a remarkable ability to inspire confidence and loyalty. His leadership, often described as making the best out of limited resources, was critical in our campaign. The incident of the 3 bunkers and my tin of fruit or carrots is etched in my memory because it was my baptism of fire and the closest I came to participating in the capture of Maictilaw. Although our battalion was heavily involved in the fighting, 9 sections saw nothing of the action, enduring only tired feet and boredom from marching in the sun. They did not dwell on it, understanding that such things tend to balance out over time. However, it always felt unfair that while one company might be resting, another could be facing intense combat. I learned that the size and importance of an action do not necessarily correlate with its personal impact. A major operation might be relatively easy for some, while a small, forgotten patrol could be a nightmare. The capture of Maictilaw, for me, is symbolized by that gallon tin, while other episodes that still haunt me barely receive mention in regimental history. Mention Maictilaw to any surviving member of my old section, and he might nod and say, aye, but bring up a lesser-known engagement, and you would get a far more passionate response. We knew that the Japanese had fought fiercely at Maictilaw. Rumors circulated that over 100 wounded soldiers had committed suicide rather than be captured, which turned out to be true. Despite the severe losses they had suffered at Impel, there had been no signs of surrender. Our platoon position was on the perimeter, overlooking 100 yards of flat ground with undergrowth and a thick wood to our right front. We dug our 2-man rifle pits just inside a sloping horizontal apron of barbed wire. There were 2 brigades inside the wire, enclosing the lakes in a box about 4 miles by 3. When the 3rd Brigade arrived by air, the entire Black Cat Division was within the anvil, surrounded by superior enemy forces, and waiting for the hammer of the 5th Division, and, in the meantime, the Japanese. Sergeant Hutton predicted that the Japanese would attack us fiercely, and the section responded with their usual pessimistic banter. However, beneath the complaints, the men were in good spirits. The British soldier is famous for complaining, but for sheer prolonged grumbling in adversity, no one can beat the English West March. Yet, they took pleasure in reviling each other, and I remember those section brew-ups as some of the friendliest gatherings of my life. If the knowledge that we were surrounded and outnumbered by a ruthless enemy worried them, it did not show. Unlike today, where frontline troops might confess to being scared, back then, it was simply not done. It was not just out of pride, but because it would sap confidence in oneself, one's comrades, and among those at home. I was a worried man in Burma, but I hope it did not show. Nothing bolstered my morale more than the expectation that, as a Scot, I would be a wild man, a head case. This age-old belief among the English that their northern neighbours are desperate fellows was a huge encouragement when I was 19 and unsure of how I would perform under fire. 9th Section embodied morale, along with Sergeant Hutton, the courteous and soft-spoken company commander Long John, and the tough, black-browed colonel. And let's not forget the Gurkhas along the wire, grinning and chirruping, and the fearsome Baluchi hillmen. You felt you were in good company. The Japanese were not going to stop this lot. The only remaining question was whether they would stop me. Well, we would just have to see. There was no sense worrying about it. But the biggest boost to morale came from the burly man who spoke to our battalion by the lake shore, General Slim. Slim was not an orator, but he had a force of personality that was undeniable. His appearance was plain, large, heavily built, with a grim face, hard mouth, and bulldog chin. His delivery was blunt and matter-of-fact, without gestures or mannerisms. He knew how to make an entrance, and it came naturally. Slim emerged from under the trees by the lake shore, and without fanfare, he just stood with his thumb hooked in his carbine sling and talked about how we had caught the Japanese off balance and were going to annihilate them in the open. There was no exhortation or ringing clichés, no jokes or self-conscious use of barrack room slang. When he called the Japanese bastards, it was casual and without heat. He was telling us informally what would be, in the reflective way of intimate conversation. And we believed every word, and it all came true. Slim's strength lay in his ability to connect with his soldiers. He had risen through the ranks, having enlisted in 1914, fought in the trenches and at Gallipoli, and climbed the ranks on his own merits. His accent was respectable, no more, and he couldn't have talked down to us if he tried. We knew that when he talked of smashing the Japanese, he understood what it meant at our level. He thought like a private soldier, and that gave the 14th Army its overwhelming confidence. What he promised, he would surely do. Perhaps the most revealing story about Slim and what his army thought of him tells how he was addressing a unit preparing for action. The magic must have worked again, for some enthusiast actually shouted, "We'll follow you, General." And Slim, with one of his rare smiles, called back, "Don't you believe it? You'll be a long way in front of me." Not many generals could have gotten away with that. It was Slim's way of saying that he trusted us to do our job, and we trusted him to do his. British soldiers don't love their commanders, much less worship them, but the 14th Army trusted Slim and thought of him as one of their own. Perhaps his real secret was that the feeling was mutual. I have a picture of him at a Burma reunion, standing awkwardly but looking content, surrounded by his soldiers, grinning and jostling around him, just like that day by the lake when he nodded, wished us luck, and turned away under the trees. I know I have not done him justice. I can only say what Kenneth Roberts wrote of Robert Rogers: the thought of him was like home and safety. That concludes the second part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please consider subscribing for more episodes.